All right, so we're recording, so anything you say now will end up on YouTube. So you've been notified. So,
Thanks for the heads up.
no. And okay. And I think I'm just gonna keep it in this mode. Otherwise, I think it's a little weird sometimes when you're like presenting on Zoom and you're like managing the PowerPoint and like people are floating on the side. So you'll just be able to see the little queue of slides as we kind of work through. So, oh, Sarah? Where did Sarah go? Sarah, I panicked. We lost you for a second.
I got lost. I was like, what happened? It must have been the internet on this end.
Yeah. It's fun to get that sign, your internet is unstable. It makes you very
It didn't even give me that warning. I'm like, I'm just gone. I'm like, what happened?
All right. Well, I'll just vamp next time if hopefully that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, because I was asking if you could hear drums because my husband is drumming in the bedroom down the hall.
Oh,
So I didn't know if that was distracting. I was going to tell him to stop if need be.
nope. Sounds
Okay.
fine. Okay, and we're recording at this point, and I think we'll just let anyone else who's interested, they'll just show up at this point. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to Intro to Props Design. Hello, this is a workshop that I have offered a couple times in the past, but it's been recorded as a podcast. And in this day and age that we are in, it is being recorded and put on YouTube. So if you're interested in this topic, but with different presenters, you can find it in TRP's podcast series. And I think we have one other person joining. I think that's Kylie. So Kylie, whenever you're joining, Kylie, just know that we're recording at this point. So if you say anything, it'll be recorded and put on YouTube later. So you have been warned. So just to kind of give an overview of what this evening is about. So it is Intro to Props. So we're going to be very focused on props. But we're going to kind of touch on a couple different topics that fall under that umbrella, which include script analysis, relationship with the director, paperwork, because I don't think props could happen without paperwork. Maybe Sarah, you have opinions on that too.
Props are paperwork and props run paperwork, or paperwork runs props.
Convenient to have a paper prop right here. Huh, look at that. And then we're just gonna kind of talk about adding props, acquiring props, building props, and then always just good to kind of touch on safety as well. So we'll do some introductions so you kind of know who's talking. My name is Sadie. I've been around Theater in the Round a lot in the last 10 years, doing different workshops. I'm on the board. I do a lot of design here as well. A little bit more about myself. I have a double major in theater studies and arts administration from a Viterbo University. Fun fact, I gave a presentation to Viterbo students today. It's a presentation heavy day. And then I've been freelance set and prop designing in the Twin Cities since I graduated back in 2012. Right now I'm actually back in school for architectural drafting to kind of beef up some of my technical skills around drafting. So that's me, but also in this presentation we have the fabulous Sarah Gullickson.
Ooh,
yay, yay.
fabulous, exciting.
About yourself.
Hi, yes, and like it says right there, I majored in theater arts and English at the University of Minnesota Morris, and I'm head of props at the Guthrie, and there isn't a ton of stuff in between because I showed up on the Guthrie's doorstep once I was done with college and was an intern in the prop department, and by day I worked in the box office by night, and I've had a few different positions at the Guthrie and in the box office and marketing. Then became the associate prop manager, and then a couple years ago, the head of the prop department. So there have been some design things and work at other theaters in between, but Guthrie is the through line from since college.
And I always think of meeting Sarah specifically when I was at Prop Rentals, being my own, freelance set designer. And I used to work at the Guthrie, but now I don't. But I remember the day that an email announcement went out at the Guthrie was a day that I happened to be at prop rental at the Guthrie, and Sarah was like, so I guess I'm gonna be working with you soon. And I was like, how fun. If you haven't been to Guthrie prop rentals, you should. I don't know when it's coming back, but you should get there at some point because it's one of my favorite places in the world. So
It's a great question. When is it coming back? We're not sure at this point, but yes.
Yeah.
Talk to me and maybe at least we could do I'd send you a picture of it.
One thing about this presentation that's maybe a little bit different than our set design one, we do have some sample paperwork that we'll send out to folks. So if you want to add your email address in the chat, do that so that we can send you some materials. Because I think we've got some paperwork and then just also some resources that Sarah has access to that we just want to be able to share. So if you would like that, do feel free to add that. And I can see that we've already gotten some email addresses, which is fantastic. So we will be sure to get that information out to you. Oops, I clicked on things and now my screen is freaking out at me. Zoom presentations are fun. Okay, so we're just gonna dive into what is a prop. And I specifically love that we've got, you know, kind of theater in the round versus the Guthrie. I shouldn't say versus. That makes it sound like it's competing. And that's not what I'm trying to say. It's just that different theaters do props differently. So I've always kind of approached it as a general rule. If you hold it, it's a prop. If you walk or sit on it, it's a set. And if you wear it, it's a costume. But I think the Guthrie might have a different breakdown or a different analogy, if you want to explain that, Sarah.
Yeah, the analogy we use a lot is the moving van. If you're moving your home, you are packing up your costumes and your props to bring with you, and you're leaving the set behind. So if you, in our case, if you sit on it, it probably is a prop because we're chairs, we're the dining room table, we're the bed. You know, we're all the furniture pieces. We are the artwork on the walls, but we're not the walls. We are your area rug, but we're not your wall-to-wall carpet. So that's how we define things a lot.
And I think one other example you gave was an umbrella versus a parasol.
Yes, that's where we combine with costumes a lot. We tend to be umbrellas in the prop department, and the costume department tends to take care of parasols because they tend to want to coordinate with the outfits. So
yeah, so that's just kind of a broad, as we're talking about umbrellas, a broad umbrella overview of what is a prop. But I think what's really important is, you know, especially if you're interested in freelance prop design, is, you know, different theaters do operate differently. So this is just two examples. So particularly if you're going to do props someplace else, it's always good to kind of have that conversation up front. I know at some theaters, sometimes the stage manager ends up being the props manager. So I think props have a way of, you know, kind of being unique to every theater, but they're very needed in every show because props do elevate storytelling. Because sometimes with props, you can feel like you're just getting a list of things, but really it helps ground us in the reality that we're in. Sarah, I don't know if you have any like good examples of times that you felt like props really like changed the storytelling of a play or anything like that.
Oh, I think a lot about interiors of homes. Like I feel like set dressing, which are part of props at the Guthrie, tells so much of the story. Like you get an understanding of the characters. I think we'll see a photo later on. That's a really good example of that too, of the royal family. And I'll talk maybe a little bit more about it then. But in the same way that maybe you don't always notice the prop, and that's okay, that we're supposed to be part of the storytelling, but not always be the story that's being told. So we also, you know, maybe want paintings on a wall, but we maybe don't want them to be too interesting to pull too much focus. So it's a balance of what's actually needed and the designer and director's vision.
Yeah, and before we move on to the next slide, just because I know the couple of us on this phone call, you know, I think have a range of theater experience. Does anyone else have anything to add about what they think a prop is or how it elevates the storytelling. I can see Libby's thinking.
Well, and I was just thinking, like, behind me is very boring. I've only got the walls. You know, it's an interesting color maybe, but like behind all of you, I'm seeing all of the props that are filling your spaces, and it's great. You know, Lori's actively using hand props right now. That's so fantastic. Annalise, your headphones, you know, that might be a coordination, depending if they actually had a function. Probably not in the show. But, you know, we're going to talk to costumes about that.
I guess the only thing I would add is just kind of the way I think of props sometimes, especially when as it relates to set dressing, is that it can often be like the heart of the design. You know what I mean? Like the structures, like, you know, the bones, but then you guys add like so much more personality and life. Like it's kind of how I view them.
Yeah, I mean, you learn about the characters a lot by what they have around them.
Yeah,
I look
pretty
very
cool.
important right now. You all look interesting.
Excellent. So that's kind of, you know, broad topics of what a prop is. But I think we know that theater is a very collaborative art form. And I think in the way that I've kind of already described that every theater works a little differently, I think that there's also different ways that you work with the different other roles in theater as a props person. So in broad strokes, you know, you're going to work with the director, stage manager, set, costume, lighting, probably sound designer, depending if there's anything unique, and actors and run crew as well. But again, it might be different, kind of depending on how every theater works. I think in general, there's always in my experience, a very like straight line of relationship between the director, stage manager, and set designer for sure. But every production's a little bit different. Sarah, I don't know what you have to elaborate on that.
I would say, like, just building on what you've said, Sadie, I really feel like I'm reporting to the set designer and to the director. I'm working in collaboration a lot with the stage manager who are my eyes and ears in the rehearsal room. And everyone we've got on this list is important because we collaborate in different ways and different points along the timeline of building a production too. So like I will get in pretty early in the process, you know, at a set concept level, you know, after director and designer have gotten to meet, then I'll start to hear about what they're thinking prop wise. So I'm starting to build ideas and figure out how we're going to produce everything in our department. But then when the stage manager comes on board, then I'm transferring information to them, who they later transfer information back to me.
And
yeah, I love it because it is a collaboration.
one thing that I think is like really particularly unique about the Guthrie's prop shop is its proximity to the rehearsal rooms. Because I think that was an intentional part of the architectural design of that building, that you had close proximity to the rehearsal rooms, correct?
Correct. Yeah, we are on the first floor along with the 3 rehearsal rooms. So that way, if there was a need in rehearsal, we're just down the way and we can talk with stage management. Or if we need to pop into rehearsal and watch a scene or see how they're doing some fight choreography or something that really would help for the prop people to see happening so that we can make sure we're getting the right thing for that moment in the show. It's delightful to be so close.
And then, because at the Guthrie, do you talk directly with the actors about props, Sarah, or is all of that communication funneled through the stage manager?
It's mostly funneled through the stage manager. We will occasionally have prop fittings, just like there's costume fittings, you know, Tiny Tim every year, even if it's the same Tiny Tim, they've grown. So we always check their crutch, make sure it's the proper height and add some to it or take some away. Yeah, so for special things like that, we'll be a little bit more one-on-one with the actor, but primarily it's coming through stage management.
Yeah, and that's, I think, kind of a main difference between like a union house compared to, say, Theater in the Round that's a community theater, because at Theater in the Round, I think I've only technically done props once here. I've done a lot of set design, a lot of other stuff, but I think I've only done props once technically. And, but you're much more likely to just go and talk directly with the actor. But I think it's always good, kind of like, I'm just going to keep reiterating it. Make sure expectations are clear depending on the production you're working on and the theater that you're working with about who needs to be involved in what decision process. Because there's some things that, you know, it can just be a decision of, you know, I know you need it this way, so I need it. But I've also had certain things in life where it's like, I need to know that stage management, you know, here at Theater in the Round maybe knows how to repair a prop if it breaks during a show, if we have a strong sense that it has the potential for breaking. Because I've also made multiple props of things at Park Square when I've done actually more props at Park Square than any other theater. I've made multiples, in which case I have very like detailed conversations with my stage manager to be like, we know that this will break, so I've made 2 extra because it might break twice. So you've got to build those relationships kind of throughout a production as well. Another thing that's always going to kind of set expectations right off the bat for any production is budget. And I think it's true of any aspect of design, but you know, design within your budget or you're going to get really creative. I think, Sarah, you've got a really good example here because I think these are fake Louis Vuitton bags.
Yes, we sometimes call them the Fooey Vuitton in our prop shop. These were originally made back in like 2007 for a production of As You Like It. And the moment in the show was we wanted to have a character enter and like her valet was just loaded down with Louis Vuitton luggage, you know, just gives a, you know, a bit of information about her status and her wealth level to have this great, lovely, expensive luggage and a lot of it. And, you know, we can't afford that. That would be way more than my entire budget for the show. So what we did was bought some Louis Vuitton fabric by the yard and ended up recovering some Samsonite, much more affordable luggage that we actually mostly had in stock anyway. And I'm pointing at it, you can't see me point at it. The little tiny little travel bag, yeah. So that one's like hand painted with the little Louis Vuitton logo on there. But, you know, thousands of dollars less expensive than trying to get the real thing.
I also think of shows that have consumable foods in them as having larger budgets. So anytime I have a director want something to be actually eaten on stage and I feel like I don't have the budget for it, I'm like, and where's that money coming from? Because if we're going to do that and you're going to have a sandwich every night, we got to pay for that sandwich every night. So,
Absolutely.
You know, that's where budget can also be kind of a tool for conversation, for really making sure that everyone's on the same page with like the level of detail or like how many props there need to be. Because I have been in some situations where so many props were requested and I was like, there is physically no way this is happening. And so I went to production management and I was like, you can either choose which prop or you can give me more money. So that's how that happened.
Yeah. And ideally, you know, you kind of know before rehearsals start the baseline of what the props are in the show, just based from reading the script. I'm not getting ahead of ourselves here, but things, that's the thing about props, is things are going to keep getting added during rehearsals as they're making discoveries. So always having a little bit of reserve for either something breaking or something getting added is a good rule of thumb.
I think also the kind of stage that you're on is always going to inform your props. I do props very differently. Well, I design very differently at Theater in the Round versus at Park Square, which is a proscenium, or if I'm at Park Square on the thrust. Because, you know, in the arena, you've got to have a perfect, you know, 360 of your vintage toaster. And in an arena, someone might like come up to it and be like, what's in there? Is that toast? That's not toast. I want toast. Whereas in a proscenium, you might get away with, you know, just the front of it, depending on how it's staged. Because I know Sarah if you want to talk about kind of the difference between the thrust and the proscenium at the Guthrie.
Yeah. So thrust stage, we've got audience on 3 sides. And it could be, you know, depending on where the prop is placed, something fairly close to the audience, like maybe within five or so feet. Or it could be 40 feet away. So that kind of actually helps guide also the finish on something. Because if it's something that's got to be close and got to look really good for audience to see it, you know, we'll do a little more finessing. If it's far enough away, you know, sometimes we have to remind ourselves, as perfect as we want everything to be, sometimes our time is better spent on that thing closer to the audience or that's handled more. Sometimes we'll say, you know, step back 15 feet and squint at it, because really that's probably what most people are going to see. But, you know, I would add, and Sadie, since last month when we met to discuss this, I would also add online or video, because now with the pandemic, that's been something I've done 2 shows now, and I'm like, that prop was never meant to be seen so close, you know, because it was on video, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that wasn't meant for a close-up.
Yeah. Well, if Libby chimes in, she can also speak to the level of detail expected in film as well. I know she's faceless right now. But Libby, if you have anything to add to that kind of film approach versus theater as well.
Well, I mean, it's exactly what Sarah said. I mean, like, if it's supposed to be real, it has to be real. Like, you can't really get away with, and even if things like there's like a gap in your wall, it's like a quarter of an inch. If you're watching, you know what I mean? I'm always going to go back to scenery, but everything is seen with a microscope. So it's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of a phrase I use in scenic painting as well. You know, in theaters, you know, turn your back, walk away, you know, 20 feet, and then look at it, and what does it look like from a distance? So I think understanding the point of view of your audience and how they're going to see it, because sometimes you do see some theater props up close and you're like, that looks way different up close than what I thought it was. Because I've had that experience too, where I'm like, I don't know what my eye thought I was seeing, but this is not what I thought I saw in this show, which is, you know, kind of a cool and interesting thing as well.
And working with lighting in that too. Like, we've had many times where we've had to have red wine on stage, and if the lighting is, you know, a different color being shown at it, like where this fake wine looked really great, you know, matched up perfectly, you know, the fake Merlot and real Merlot, but then you get some stage lights and you're like, why is it pink? You know, why is it's not as Infidel, like what happened?
We had to change out like entire like bed sets, like, and we had to go and buy multiple different colors to get it back to brown. Yeah, sometimes. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Yeah. So definitely budget and the stage that are on are definitely going to set the tone for your production right off the bat. So usually, you know, when kind of the first starting spot is a script analysis, usually starting with a prop breakdown, because usually start by reading the script and figuring out, okay, what does the script call for? And I usually think of, when I'm doing props, what is my paperwork versus the stage manager's paperwork? And frequently on productions, I have had very detailed conversations, you know, again, working in different venues with the stage manager to be like, for this show, I don't think we need to keep our 2 different lists. How about we just make a Google document? But then there's been some shows where I'm like, I want to touch your list because you're tracking that and I don't need that. So paperwork, I've sometimes dealt with on a case-by-case basis in terms of like what the needs of the production are. Noises off is always a classic example. Sarah has done like the textbook perfect noises off, so I don't know if you want to talk about that or a different example, Sarah.
Oh my gosh, I don't know if we could say textbook perfect. The mishap.
Textbook perfect.
I mean, it was pretty beautiful and pretty amazing. There was the time, you know, during opening night when the door fell off.
But it's so appropriate because it was opening night.
It is so perfect in an ironic, whatever way. And there was the one day when the rotating stage did not rotate. That was entertaining too. But yes. So, you know, thank goodness for stage managers. Because just like Sadie said, tracking all these props, Noises Off is a perfect example because there's different plates of sardines that have to come and go. We needed to know whether, was this plate of sardines just passed along? Does someone have to pull a sardine? How is this getting handled? Is it going to get thrown? So or do we need to see like wiggling happening from the sardines? There was a travel bag that has to exit one door and comes in another. And then we're going to find out, do I need to make just one of these, or do we need a double? Because really physically, we don't want anyone to get hurt trying to get the prop over to its next entrance. So yes, thank goodness for stage management and keeping track of when and where we may need doubles. Yeah, I mean, that shows such a trip. And if you haven't gotten to see it or do it, it's worth it just for the imagining doing the props on that one. So.
Oh, sorry, I interrupted. Do you have
No,
any-
I just think it's fun.
One other thing I just want to throw in about script analysis is sometimes, because I think as a freelance set designer, I think I have, also kind of a slightly different set of resources to work within compared to Sarah, who has a shop of very skilled artisans who have a very large range of skill sets. So one thing I like to, for myself, when I'm doing freelance designing in script analysis, I like to really know what are the props that are really critical to the storytelling versus like, why'd you add that apple for that actor to eat on stage? Because I like to kind of know for myself and how I'm prioritizing my time and building and finding these things. Like, I'm going to get the thing that tells the story. And if it takes a little bit longer to get this other thing that you've requested, but maybe doesn't add to the storytelling, I like to track that in my own paperwork, depending on the production as well.
And there's, certainly scripts that where playwrights will call out right in the stage directions, this prop, this prop, this prop. There's others that, you really need to read the show to infer, like, oh, they're going to need a journal. If they've got a journal, they're going to need a writing utensil. Or they're serving breakfast. What's involved with that? So you also get to do a little detective work trying to figure out what might be in there. And what we'll do is pull, always tea. And what goes with tea? Do they have to actually drink the tea? Do they need sugar? Do they need spoons? Do we want liquid? Can the actor drink tea? Or do we need something else? There's any number of questions. Oh, when we get to like food, that's a whole thing.
And as I mentioned, we'll email out some samples. These are just a couple of screenshots of some of the things that Sarah has put together that we'll send those that have added their email to it. And I think, Sarah, is there anything you want to say about some of these templates that we'll be sending out? Because I think some of them are newer productions that you're working on, like right now.
This one right now, actually, Dining with the Ancestors, is available just to view from the Guthrie's website. It was a really cool project to work on. It's a brand new part of a play that we were kind of workshopping, but in a really fully developed sort of way. There's costumes, set, and props. And I got to do the set and props design on it. But it was fascinating because it was literally being written as they started rehearsal. And this was the first time where we've gotten to have more than one actor in a room without a mask. And that's a whole separate thing that's not related to props necessarily, but all the protocols that go with that. Of course, there's a lot of prop cleaning, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. But this one, the paperwork for Dining with the Ancestors, and I will freely admit it's not my paperwork, is the paperwork of our wonderful stage manager, Lindsay Harder. And she did fantastic paperwork, and she also took, and most stage managers will do this, take pictures of presets. It's especially, it's important for stage, but it's important for film for continuity. We want to make sure that when we're filming that particular scene or shot repeatedly, that the teacup, always starts in the same place with the handle facing the correct way. for Dickens' Holiday Classic, our retelling of Christmas Carol this year, I had a whole spreadsheet just about with what height the candles should start at different scenes. Because if we went back to film it, it was like, oh, that needs to be back to 3.5 inches, so that when we're watching it, you know, the candle height isn't, because the candle was burning throughout the whole film. Anyway, paperwork's important. What I love about Lindsay's paperwork that we'll send out is some of her examples of preset as well. It's just, I just really admire good paperwork.
I watched that Christmas Carol, and I'm so pleased to know that there is a spreadsheet just for that candle. So, so just to kind of wrap up paperwork before we move on to other things, I think the important thing is that your paperwork is to stay organized. I remember in college I did a production of chess, and I think that that's literally the biggest prop list I've ever had. I think there were something like 400 props, and like I had this whole like manual for the stage crew, because like every chess preset had to be set a specific way so that they could actually do the moves coordinated to the song. So, you know, the paperwork is there to help you stay organized. Also, paperwork can include budgets and receipts, and then how to run the show. So it's kind of like there's phases of paperwork to things. So,
and as freelance, I mean, it's always important to keep track of your receipts, but you know, you might be getting reimbursed for what you've spent out of pocket. So really important to hold on to those and keep track of your mileage, you know, and if that's something you get reimbursed for.
So then we're getting into research. And so I think the thing to lead with is just baseline, know your time period. Like, what time period is this bottle of Coke from? Sarah, do you know? I don't actually know. I just found this down in the prop room and I thought it was cool. So
I would say the 50s.
it's fake, so it's all good. But I think research can come in many forms in terms of internet, book research, firsthand, visual, historical. It all kind of depends on what is needed for the production as well. Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to kind of add about research.
Yeah, what you say about time period, that's my first question, especially if we're doing a Shakespeare production. Because it can range so wildly. You know, I need to know if there's a fight, are we doing this with swords or are we doing this with guns? You know, it's going to change my approach quite a bit. And then, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's so much research that can be done online now, of course. But I still love books. So I've got an office full of books. Catalogs, like Sears catalogs, if we're doing something of that era, it's so great to just look back and like what might have been in the average household at this time. And like if you're doing, you know, well before Sears catalogs, doing a piece like artwork of that time can also get you a glimpse of like what might the bowls be, or you know, what do the chairs look like of that period. Super helpful.
Yeah, when you also mention Shakespeare, I also think of Shakespeare that is not in a time period, because I think most people have worked on a production like that or seen a production like that where it's like somehow like steampunk, but somehow like not. And so even if it's not an exact time period, I think it's important, you know, kind of going back to the people that you work with, having that shared like visual vocabulary and research, because when it's like, when we're talking about steampunk, are we talking about like this style of steampunk or like this style of steampunk? Because I know, like, you said it really beautifully earlier, Sarah, where you said like sometimes the best props you don't actually see because they just fit in the world that you've all collectively created. And sometimes it's like the best compliment when it just fits in so well that you're like, I didn't even see it because it just fits in. But I think there's also scenarios where sometimes you're like, did you get that from the dollar store? What's going on with that comb? Like, what is that? So I think it's important to share research as well, particularly if you're in kind of a created universe kind of situation.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
So just to kind of recap the phases of props design, or kind of the process. So generally you're going to start with your script analysis and research, work on a design concept with, usually it starts with the director, but I think, you know, again, depending on the production, depending on the theater that you're at, it can be a direct conversation with the set designer in a lot of ways. You're gonna, to me, there's like a certain amount of prep work that you can do for props, but there is only so much you can do until rehearsal starts. And then once rehearsal starts, it is like everyday new information kind of a thing. Because I've had some, you know, freelance situations where I'm just like really fascinated with some of the things that they come out of with rehearsal. I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Like I never would have thought of that. And then there's some rehearsal reports where you're like, I don't want to open it because it's going to be scary. Because it's sometimes so many props get added where I'm like, how did you think of that much stuff in a 2-hour rehearsal process? And, you know, and that's, I think, and compared to say set design, you know, as a freelancer, if I'm doing a set design, I know a lot of my work in the production is going to be pre-rehearsal. But if I'm doing a props design, I know my time is dedicated to rehearsal time and tech week when I'm doing props. So when I'm freelancing and kind of stacking productions with each other, I always keep that in mind, that I can't think of a timeline for props the same as I think of sets. It's two very different time frames.
And then it's kind of like both time frames for me at the Guthrie, because from our designers, the prop finals are due the same time as set finals. And that's for the large items because we are furniture and things like that. So we expect that to be locked in stone. The things that are more geared towards actor or director, then those are the things that will keep coming up in rehearsal reports. And we sure know the day that they are on their feet for the first time and they've left the table, because that's the pages of notes you were talking about, Sadie.
Yeah, I think most props people can kind of know that feel of when you've kind of stepped away from table work and it's like, oh, we don't have scripts in our hands anymore. We have props in our hands because we got a lot of information now. So there's definitely the rehearsal process, which is its own thing to manage and work with all of your other designers and and production team members. And then when you get to tech week, you know, there's some productions where by the time you get to tech week, you're like, I got this, we're good. We had a smooth rehearsal process. It's British living room. Please don't break a teacup kind of a thing. And then there's some tech weeks where you just get a lot of information. So I don't know if you have a good example of a good tech week story, Sarah.
Ooh, I'm trying to think one that's like focus on well, okay. We had one, and really the prop got added, I think during load-in week, the week before tech. This is not that long ago, our production of the Glass Menagerie, most recently.
It was going to be this story.
And it was directed by our artistic director, Joe Hodge, and he had a beautiful idea. And I don't know if you all know the play, but it's kind of about this family, and there's this young woman who's struggles, has a lot of struggles, and she's kind of having this beautiful moment where I think she's feeling like she gets to be her own self and kind of coming into her own a little bit, and she's dancing with the gentleman caller. So Joe had this vision of, during this, that the vase of yellow jonquils turned into a vase of blue roses, because that was one of her nicknames from the gentleman caller. Used to call her Blue Roses. And that it should magically happen during the dance. And then she falls, and they transform back into the yellow jonquils, which are kind of representative of her mother. And I was like, oh, that's a really great idea. It's the week before tech, and that sounds amazing. Well, at first, actually, I was like, well, you're kind of joking, right? And he's like, no. So we're trying to figure out how to do it. And Rebecca Malmstrom from the prop shop, she's our shopper buyer and an artisan, had found online this magic trick that grew red roses. It was like a green leaves and then roses bloom in it. And it was remote control operated. So she took this and with help of other people in the shop too, and swapped out the red roses for blue roses, and we had jonquils that were tucked in originally, and then when it's essentially like straws, and then like the thing sticks up through the straw. I don't know if I'm explaining it well. Anyway, the button happened, and we transformed. The blue roses bloomed, and they kind of pushed back the yellow jonquils, so we couldn't see them anymore. But like we had to wait for this magic trick to arrive from China, and we didn't know if this was going to work, and we didn't have any time to do any sort of research and development on this. And thankfully, it just took a little tweaking, but it worked. And of course, we never want to introduce a new prop right before a show. We always need to have time to rehearse with it first. So, oh my gosh, it got there just in time so that we could tech it. It got a light special on it. They had to have this special moment, and yeah. Anyway, that was probably too long a story. Now just reliving it there.
We'll move on.
Yeah.
It's a good story though. It was a beautiful effect. I loved it. It was very nice. Because there's things, that Tech Week is definitely very critical, because that's where all the other production elements are coming together. Sometimes props get cut that you spent a lot of time on. Sometimes they get added. Sometimes you have to negotiate if things get added. And then there's also maintaining a show, which I think you build a show very differently if it's going to run 3 weekends versus 3 months. I know a lot of the furniture at the Guthrie is reinforced. I've definitely seen furniture break in productions, and then you either have to fix it or come up with another chair really quickly. And then there's always strike and rental returns, because that's always something to manage after a production's done too. So you got to keep the whole scope in mind whenever you're doing props. So production meetings, very important. This is an opportunity to really get to know what the production's about, get to know kind of your working styles with each other a little bit. Sometimes when you've worked with someone, you kind of have that shorthand. So sometimes production meetings are really quick. Sometimes you're doing Shakespeare in space, so you have really long production meetings because you're like, what is Shakespeare in space? Why are we doing this? But I think it's a really important opportunity to ask questions. And sometimes the difficult part is knowing what question to ask. And sometimes that does come from experience. But I know, Sarah, you kind of illuminated some good kind of food prop questions already. If you have anything to add about kind of production meetings and their importance.
Oh, I love them. Sometimes there's conversations that can just happen in hallways or separately, but sometimes it's great when there's things that involve multiple departments that we can go over in a production meeting. And I'm thinking about, prop wise, it might be, where we are at with building a piano, because that affects sounds, because they need to put speakers in it and a keyboard. It's a good time to touch base, or to get clarification on things. Because sometimes you'll get a note from rehearsal and you're like, I'm not quite sure what that means. And a production meeting is a good time to be able to hear the director talk about it as well. Now most of our scene designers are out of town, so we may just have them on the phone call, but when they are in the building, they usually come to the meetings too. I'm trying to think of other good examples, but can be super useful. My rule of thumb is if it affects, 1 or 2 other departments, I for sure want to bring it up.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, compared to kind of a side conversation, or sometimes a production meeting is when I'm like, I'm gonna come find you and talk to you, and so no one else needs to hear it, but I'm gonna find you, especially if it's someone that doesn't respond to emails, which is my favorite, not favorite. Rehearsal rehearsal props, I think, are really important to kind of factor into your overall planning. Because sometimes, kind of going back to what we were saying about rehearsal, sometimes you don't 100% know how a prop is going to be used until they actually work with it. Or maybe you have like a very precious tea set that you don't want them to break, so you give them plastic mugs to be able to accidentally hit around and such. But I think it's always important, you know, as we're talking about production meetings, to understand what are they going to need right away, to kind of get on their feet and start working with things. And it's also really helpful to track props as well, because sometimes you don't actually notice a tracking problem until you're like literally saying like, oh, that coffee cup crosses across stage, and maybe we need a double, kind of a thing. So
Yeah. And then I would say too that for the most part, if I'm not worried about the prop surviving rehearsal, we'll try to put the real thing in as soon as we can. And if we can't, I try to have something that's as close to the real thing as possible. So like maybe we're building and upholstering a sofa. So that's going to take us a little time to do while they're rehearsing. So I'm going to find something from my stock that is as close in size to the real thing, so they don't get used to having something that's like 2 feet longer than it will actually be. And sometimes in that case, size is more important than style. Like I might give them a modern sofa that's the right size versus, you know, the correct Victorian settee. So just because sometimes, and we'll usually label things, this is rehearsal, this is auditioning to be the real prop, and we'll say real prop. If it's something that the designers picked out and like we know this wants to be the real thing, we'll put that on there. And we want to make very sure that things that are for sure the designer doesn't want to appear on their stage is labeled rehearsal, because it has happened before where a director's fallen in love with a rehearsal prop and we're like, but we just spent 3 weeks building you a new sofa. Oh, great. Okay, let me just let the designer know.
yeah, and in freelancing, sometimes I've had it go the other way too, where I'm like, oh, that's the real thing, and they're like, oh, that is not the real thing, and I'm like, oh, that is not the real thing. I'll keep working with it. Let me go update my spreadsheet. So
Yeah, and better to know sooner than later.
yeah. And we've touched on this topic a little bit, but it's adding props, because we've definitely talked about how in a rehearsal process, I don't think I've ever been in a rehearsal process where a prop hasn't been added. Like there's always something that's added, I think.
Yeah.
I think maybe like the 1 or 2 times that that's happened, it's because it was a very like concept driven piece that it's like, this is what we need to tell the story, and we know that we don't need anything extra, and then as a stylistic part of the storytelling to not have props. Like Our Town comes to mind. Isn't Our Town one of those shows that has no props? So
Yeah, well, you can just imagine.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I always think it's important to schedule a walkthrough with the director and always try and have a deadline for like a last prop add date. Because I think for freelancing, sometimes you can look at a list and be like, yeah, we can probably add some stuff last minute and it'll be fine. And then there's some productions where you're like, you're gonna have to give me your firstborn child if you want another prop. Like that's not happening. So I don't know, do you have formal like prop walkthroughs, Sarah?
I do usually have one with stage management and the director, if I can, while they're still in the rehearsal room before we've moved to stage. And I call it the real versus rehearsal talk. And we'll just go through the prop list and check off like, yep, that's the real thing, that's the real thing. Oh, you don't think that's the real thing? Good to know. Or like, I promise you we're working on this, we'll have this for you when you get up to stage. So that way it's just kind of, I know what really distilled down our to-do list is.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and then I usually do a walkthrough also with run crew.
Oh, yeah.
Just so they know. And you know, it depends if you're running the show yourself or if there's someone else handling it. But just to give them a heads up, like these are the, you know, they have to drink whiskey, here's our recipe.
Because I think that walkthrough with the crew can be really helpful in terms of also understanding what repairs can be made to make a prop to maintain a prop versus like, oh, this is so broken, it has to go back to the shop. I think that's an important relationship to establish as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I think that's true for freelancing too. You want to try and get your crew as up to get them familiar with it so that they can repair anything if needed. Because if you're freelancing, you don't want to be coming back to the theater if you're already working on your next show. So,
Yeah.
So there's a,
Make it as easy as possible for them to run the show.
yeah.
You know, we may have extravagant looking desserts, but really we want it to be mostly something that's prepped for them already, that they can throw some whipped cream on, and we can call it good.
Mhm.
You know.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different ways to acquire props. There's buying, I always think of some of the initial ones, there's buying, renting, building. Sarah, I feel like the Guthrie shop like particularly specializes in some cases in altering and reinforcing existing things.
Mm-hmm.
And then finding, borrowing, pulling from stock, and then in my case, stuff that I find in my mom's basement, because that happens sometimes. So.
And I would say your mom's basement also for us. Oh, very good.
I just wanted to show you this little bottle of things that I found in the prop, because just like if you find that, then you don't have to make it.
It's so good. And we've done it, you know, in our search where we will, you know, might put something on our personal Facebook. You know, does anyone have one of these? Or we'll put a question out on Nextdoor or something, you know, and we'll find a neighbor that's got something.
Mhm.
Someone else's mom's basement hasn't.
It's like surprising how much stuff is in people's basements actually. And props, I think you really learn how to embody the art of faking it. Sarah, I think this is a picture of some fabulous fake food that you provided. I have this fake ice cream cone with me. I'm not
That's
gonna
really
eat it
good.
'cause I don't know what it is, but it looks really convincing.
It does.
Got a little dribble right here.
What's the cone made out of?
This is, I think, an actual cone.
Oh.
This cone has been here as long as I've been at Theater in the Round, and I'm like, this is an old cone. Like, this thing is old. But I think
Really good.
it's like foam of some kind.
Uh-huh.
But anyways, you've got fake meat.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is an array of fake meat that we had for the Master Butcher's Singing Club, which needed a lot of meat. What you don't see there was another table, I think, of an equal variety of meats. And there was also 2 half a cows that we had hanging in the butcher shop as well, which now one of them hangs in the green grocer store of A Christmas Carol, because we love to reuse props when we can. But like the meats here are assortment of, like, I think the large sausages on the right were a bead foam that then got sculpted and coated. The smaller sausages to their left, I think, are ethafoam rod, which ethafoam rod is one of those miracle items for theater, because like we also make fake neon with it. We make fancy borders on large paintings with it. The T-bone steaks are a pourable vinyl, which was an awesome thing. So we had to make a mold of that, and then we tinted the vinyl, and then added paint and things afterwards to it. But what's great about that material, it's like the same stuff those wiggly fishing lures are made out of. So it had some jiggle to it when they picked it up, which was great. You know, just not too much, but enough. You can also melt it back down again afterwards and make something else if you want. So.
And I will say there is a little flip side to some props, because this prop in particular, this lovely little daiquiri thing, it looks like a really like good smoothie daiquiri. It sat on stage for a half hour, and I remember being like, that ain't a real daiquiri, because that ain't melting. And with my ice cream cone, that ain't melting. So goes both ways.
Yeah.
Okay. In the world of props, there's also a very particular category of special effects. I don't know the story of either of these. So Sarah, this is you.
Oh yeah, the ones on the left, the baby buggies, were like this 5-second thing you saw on stage at the very opening of Guys and Dolls. in Runyon Land. There's supposed to be all these things, all these characters coming and going. So what this was a quick card game, underground card game that was happening on top of the one baby buggy. And then when the police officer comes out to break up the game, they pull out the handle, the canopy comes up, and it looks like they're pushing a baby away. So we needed to have two of them just for tracking, one of them that had to do the whole effect, and then it had to be able to run around, and it was nutty. The snowmobile was a real snowmobile that we had to remove the engine on. And then we had to hook up, you can see the Leinenkugel's beer box on the back and some things. It was tracked across stage, underneath the stage. So, these two gods in nice fish, it was really hilarious. It's a long story, but they had to come across on the stage. And built into the back in those boxes was a snow flinger, so that it shot snow out the backside of it like a snowmobile would. Super fun, super fun.
I think one of my favorite special effects, it was Park Square at it was a production of Baskerville, which is one of those like 5-6 actors play like 50 character kinds of things. So it was very kind of slapstick kind of humor. And so the director told me right away, he's like, it was in a hotel scene and there was this desk, and the desk itself was used in a couple different iterations. So the top of the desk it rotated to have 2 different scenes on it, but then also the top of it, like you could hit it and then it would flip and then it would be another preset thing on top. And he's like, there's gonna be a flower on that desk and I want the flower to grow on stage. And I was like, all right, this is a very specific vision. I'm glad you're leading with this, because this gives me time to make this flower grow on stage. And so I ended up taking an old, it wasn't old, it was new. It was one of those telescoping hot dog tongs. And so cut off the tong part of it, and then I just glued that thing into a flower pot and then put this giant flower on it. And like, the timing that actor got on it, that got a clap every single night. And I was like, never in my life will a prop get a stop and like clap like that. It was so beautiful how well he had it like timed out. But when we started, I was like, a flower to grow on stage, you say? Fascinating. So, and that was one I actually made 3 of, because I knew it was gonna break. Because like he just like, the actor was totally in control of that, but we were like, this runs for 2 months, that is going to break. And we swapped it out after tech because it had so much of a beating just in tech that we started with a new one on opening night. So set dressing is also oh, do you have another story?
No, I was just gonna say thanks to the actor for helping sell it,
I totally, like, it could have been real bad, but he owned that and it was really good. But set dressing is also I think it's almost like its own skill set too.
Oh, definitely. That's why, like on films, that's a whole separate role. So these photos here, the one on the right, gives you a larger picture. This was our production of the royal family, which is a kind of a tribute to the life in the theater for actors, and generations of actors that live in this home. The older woman seated in the chair is the matriarch, and she's been in the theater for decades. So one of the things that was a concept of the director and designer is that we'd have all these skulls, and that was her thing. Like her and her husband, whenever they did a production of Hamlet, they got to keep Yorick. So they've collected them over the ages. And so we got to make a lot of skulls, but just like the level of detail that this story told about the actors through the set, beautiful, lovely architecture, but then just like so many different interesting props. And what you don't see is, as the show got towards the end, is those shelves opened up and like the walls opened up, and it was like literally like prop storage behind them, where it was just rows like 20 feet high at least prop storage. So we had so much of our inventory hauled over and backstage. And it was a beautiful tribute to props, but it was a lot of work. But it told me.
In terms of freelancing, set design can sometimes be a negotiation between the set designer and the props person. Because there's been some productions at Theater in the Round where I'm like, I'm doing the set dressing because I have a vision, so just let me do it. And it also can go like, you've got a really big props list, I will take care of set dressing. It's also gone in some other ways where I've been in a situation where a set designer has requested me as a props designer because they know that I do set design work and they've wanted me to do the set dressing. So I think, you know, going back again to, it depends on how the theater works, to make sure that expectation is clear, because set dressing is not something you want to not discuss, because you don't want to find out in tech week, oh, I thought you were doing that. Oh, I'm doing that? I thought you were doing that. Sometimes it's like one of the best parts of tech also is just being able to like fidget with the set dressing to get it just right. Like sometimes I'm like, I'm gonna tweak it because I'm gonna be staring at the set for this third dress rehearsal, so I'm gonna make it perfect. So we talked about the art of faking it, and sometimes things need to be real. Such at Theater in the Round here, light fixtures and phones are always a big conversation in like every first production meeting, because it also, like at Theater in the Round, you have to tape down the phone cord, so we have to know exactly what day, or, you know, we have to know which phone because we have to be able to paint the floor so that the cord is painted into the set. So that's always a big thing at Theater in the Round, as two common things. So
And we get to food, and we've got to, were you going to show something?
I just have this fake candle. Or is it fake? Do we know? It's definitely fake, but could it be real? It could be real.
Food is one of those things that can be super tricky because it is expensive if you're doing a long run. I'm thinking of our production of Floyd's, which was set in a sandwich shop or a restaurant, commercial kitchen. And, you know, we had to go through, there were some sandwiches that had to get made and eaten by cast members. Some things, we could fake some things, but like very little overall. So it was like filling this commercial kitchen for each production, because that's what we needed. That's what it had to be.
Saw a production that had its own compost bins. So
yeah.
Weapons, I think, are also kind of their own conversation in and of themselves. I think kind of particularly what you said, Sarah, about Shakespeare's, depending on the time period, can be a big thing. I think freelancing, I've worked with some fight choreographers who have said, I'm just going to take care of the swords. And I'm like, fine by me, you bring the swords. I don't want to touch those. But then sometimes, because I've done some set designs where like, oh, well, it was actually a production of Romeo and Juliet where it's like, oh, well, we're actually going to sword fight, but we're going to rip off a piece of the fencing of the set, and then we're going to fight with that. So then you got to kind of think through, well, it's set, but it's also fight choreography. Props person should probably know in case something changes. So weapons can be their own quagmire of conversation.
Yeah. Yep. And a whole thing, if you've got a firing firearm, that's the whole thing.
That's its own presentation, actually. That's its own PowerPoint, how to do that correctly. Lock them up. That's the important thing. Don't use your real gun. Those are your two points there. And then when it needs to be real, I think kind of going back to, you know, being in the round versus in proscenium, you know, there's just different levels of like what needs to be real. Going back to my lovely, authentic period toaster. It's going to be real in the round because someone's going to open it. It's going to happen. Someone is going to open it when they're on stage. We touched on safety just a little bit, talking about weapons. But I think that there's kind of a couple common things that always come up. Cigarettes and smoke, I think, are always kind of very theater specific. I think it's also very different if you're in a union house versus not union house with how cigarettes are dealt with. Live flame on stage is also one. And I think, Sarah, you chat while I fix this typo in the.
It's like you're awesome. Cigarettes, just hopping back to that, we at the Guthrie had switched primarily to doing e-cigarettes and not having, certainly not having tobacco products. We were using herbals for a while. You know, obviously e-cigarettes already also have issues. Anytime an actor has to take something into their body, that, I mean, obviously there's certain jurisdiction from the actors union, like you were talking about, Sadie, with the unions, but I mean, also just, you don't want to harm anybody. So that's a whole thing. So sometimes I think cigarettes are going to get more and more to faking it, you know, or it could be a real cigarette that's just not lit. Anyway.
Yeah.
Live flame on stage involves, you know, checking in with your fire marshal or your local fire inspector and getting a permit for that. And there, you know, you have to be very specific about where the flame will be. You have to have a plan for how to extinguish something, you know, to keep things safe.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got breaking glass next. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, Sadie. I've got a story.
Well, I always remember kind of, I do have a production that I did. I was the set designer for this. And part of the storytelling is that a brick is thrown through a window in this particular production. And so Karina Troth did all of the glass work on it. God bless Karina. I love her so much, because she would get the iso malt sugar, and she would melt it down, and we would put that pane of glass in every night. And it was really remarkable how good the effect was, because when you're hurling anything across the stage that also has to like go by an actor, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. So even when you're using sugar glass, there's still safety concerns. And also just kind of like cleanliness things to kind of keep in mind, because like all the little shards just like over time like get ground into the floor. So you just have to like mop the floor with more regularity. It was a really cool effect, but it took almost an equal amount of effort just to do that one effect compared to building the whole actual set in that production. So
Yeah.
your glass story now.
I was thinking of what, like when we have to smash a bottle over an actor's head, things like that. And we typically, and that's a whole consumables and a cost thing. We'll typically purchase those. You can certainly make them, but there's a company called Alfonso's Breakaway who does dishes and glassware and bottles. The nice thing about it, you know, you still have to be careful, but it doesn't have the same sort of sharp edge that would be as readily to cut someone.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. And then talking about consumables with actors like actually talking. I know I've had a production where like the script called for the actor to be eating candy. So my first impulse was like, well, I'm just gonna get you the candy. And then she's like, I'm gonna choke if I eat this. And I'm like, okay, please don't eat the candy then. And so we made it something else that looked like the candy, but it was dry so that she could just swallow it. And at any time there's consumables, I always ask about food allergies or dietary restrictions. Because I had to do a show once where they were unpacking, the character was kind of having a breakdown, and they were eating Chinese food out of containers with their hands. And there was some dietary restrictions that at the time I was like, that's a list. We will make sure it's good, but this is already hard enough, and now I have to make it vegan. That's great. It's going to be fine. So, and then just in terms of safety, I think whenever you're building or making a prop, I think it's really important to make sure that you're aware of any chemicals that you're using, and you know how to use the tools that you might need to be operating. So, two important things there.
don't feel bad about asking or ever advocating for yourself.
Mhm. For sure. We kind of have a couple little adages when we're talking about props. Just in terms of sometimes you need those mantras to get you through the tech week. I usually live with the pick two, good, cheap, or fast, because it might be good and cheap, it might not be fast. It might be good and fast, but it might not be cheap. You know, sometimes you just got to lean into that a little bit. And then I think, Sarah, yours is keep it realistic.
And I can't remember why I said that. I think as it, you know, as much as we want to do and have everything be perfect, I think it goes back to the step back 15 feet and squint. You know, don't harm yourself over trying to get it absolutely perfect.
And as we kind of get to kind of the end of our workshop, one thing that I think is really important is to really understand that props is like so broad in terms of what it encompasses that it's almost impossible to actually have all of the skill sets to do props as like a single freelance person. Like there's some productions where I'm like, you should not hire me, you should hire that person because they have that skill set and I don't. Because there's definitely like builders and then there's like buyer finders when it comes to props. And I think kind of what you were saying, Sarah, it's really okay to get help from other people, you know, in terms of learning new skill sets or maybe like outsourcing a specific prop to like someone that has the skill set, I think is important too. And you've got this picture of boxes, which I know has a story.
Oh my gosh, it's got a huge story. We did a production called The People's Temple, and it was about the People's Temple. And I'll let you Google that if you don't know it. And it was set in the California archives. And these boxes are bankers' boxes. And you think, well, that's easy enough, even though it's, you know, hundreds of them, you know, that's a thing. But these ones, because we were projecting on them potentially, and they were handled a lot, some of them were never touched. They were all individually painted and then each individually covered in a fabric called chincha, which is similar to cheesecloth. But we couldn't see any of the seams from the chincha because it had to look completely seamless and like that these were a solid box, not covered in fabric. And it was hundreds and hundreds of hours. And one of our strengths in our prop shop is that we're really good at figuring out how to do something. And we might have to make it once or twice, or maybe a few times if it's something that's going to break. But when we have to do it for 400 times, that's not so much the job we signed up for. But we can make it happen. We can listen to a lot of, you know, podcasts or books on tape and work as a team to get something done and try to assembly line something. But my folks were not made to do that. So this may be, as much as I try to have the conversation of like, does this really have to be this complicated? Do we really have to paint it in the specific color and cover it with fabric? But it was very important to the director and designer, and it was the majority of the props of the show. So we did it.
Yeah. So I think some productions you take on because you know it's going to be comfortable to you because it's a skill set you have. I feel like my skill set is kind of like 50-50, like find something but have a certain amount of build, because if I'm just finding, I get a little bored. But I don't want to build like some like mechanized thing that has like gizmos on it. Like, I like a nice split. So sometimes you take on a production because it feels comfortable, and sometimes you take on a production because you know it's going to push your skill set. So there's always that too. So since this is intro to props, how do I get started from here? Sarah, I think you mentioned networking at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right now, I know most of you, but you're doing it right now. So.
Well done. You already get a star for this one. I think there's a lot of great, if you're on Facebook, there's a lot of great Facebook communities. I belong to a group called SPAM, which is the Society of Props Artisan Managers. I think the requirements to join that is, you essentially, your living is done by doing props, and it's primarily for not-for-profit entities that you work for. But that being said, they do have anyone can join their Facebook page. And it's great because people will post questions or resources or things they've found, or they could say, hey, has anyone done, trying to think of a play. We could say Floyd's, how did you solve this problem? Or how did you make that trick birthday cake? Or anyone know where I could find this? So that's pretty great. Plus you also can kind of, that might be people who are students, people who are freelance, or just thinking about props, or just think props are interesting. So it's kind of great. And then you can, get to know people that way too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then theater in the round is also a really good place to get started. You don't need a whole lot of experience, to come in, because we've got a great network of people that will help you. Because some theaters you need to have a certain amount of experience maybe before someone is gonna say, yeah, I'm gonna give you a whole show. So we'll be getting back into doing some theater soon, hopefully once the pandemic's over. But it's a great place to kind of get your toes wet in props design. And sometimes, we have unique situations come up where we do have, a specific build that needs to happen. And sometimes props person is maybe dealing with other things. So, working within the community to be able to get a prop built comes up every once in a while too. Yeah, that's the presentation. Any questions from the group that we didn't cover that you were dying to know?
I had a question about I think earlier, Sarah, you were talking about that there are certain books that you keep on hand, such as like the catalogs. And I would be interested too to hear from you, Sadie, as far as like what are your go-to resources when you're doing that research phase? Because I think that's a place that if you're getting into props design, that might not be part of your background.
I know you asked Sadie, but I'm going to
both of you would be great.
I got to think about my answer.
And I'm trying to remember the title of it. It's something like what Jane Austen's War or Charles Dickens said. It's got Charles Dickens and Jane Austen in the title, but it talks a little bit, I think, like about etiquette of the time. So you're going to learn something about dishware. You might learn a little bit about their writing utensils and things like that. So various time periods will have things like that. We do have books like the history of the lighter, the history of the pen. You can get very specific. I love going to Barnes and Noble and looking at their like $5 books. And sometimes it's just it might be about, I don't love weapons, I'm going to tell you that. But, I have a lot to learn. And, they might just have a book about firearms through the ages, which I'm not going to buy that for myself personally, but I'll buy that for me professionally. So I'm trying to think of other ones. There's a lot around the Victorian time period that we use just because we have so many shows or had so many shows of that era.
I think for me, there isn't like a specific resource that I use so much as like the way that I organize things. Like I tend to really organize like a lot of my visual research in a PowerPoint because it's kind of like it's a visual medium inherently, right? So then, if it's just for me, I'm just gonna like slap some pictures together. And then I'm going to be like, I want to make sure I remember like a relationship between these two. So I'm going to like put them next to each other. And then I like that because in the notes section below the PowerPoint, I'll keep any links. So then it's just like a very like literal, like organized way for me to stay organized. And if I need to like turn around and do a design presentation, I can usually do like save as and like get rid of the things that are just for my own juji thoughts and then like really bring forward like what are the things that other people would be interested in, because there's thoughts that you have as a designer that not everyone needs to hear, but you know it informs. But then there's some pictures where you're like, once everyone sees this picture, they're going to understand where I'm coming from. And I think that that's part of, like, it's because I also do set and prop design work, that's my method for both mediums, or, you know, for both processes. So I actually have this huge file folder on my computer of like every production I've ever researched. So sometimes when I'm like, I really liked that one image that I know I had found on that show, I can go find it because I have it saved in either a file folder or a PowerPoint literally somewhere. So for me, it's more about my own organizational process. And then if there was a website that I found in another show, I can usually find it in somewhere that I saved. And then some shows I do just straight up do like Pinterest boards too, but that's a little bit more when it's like a universe that you're trying to create and not like capture something historically. So, and it also has to do with sharing too, because sometimes I might make a Google PowerPoint if I'm sharing with a designer that also likes Google PowerPoint. Kind of depends. So,
That's really helpful. Thank you.
good question though. So, other questions? Huh? Kylie, I'm just gonna pick on you slightly because you came in late and you've been on mute and hiding this whole time. So I just want to make sure that you can unmute if you want to. You don't have to, but I'm just saying. So. If there aren't any other questions or anything to add, because I know Lori and Libby, you both have a certain amount of experience. If there's anything else you want to add before I turn off the recording, to just throw in there.
I don't know how to phrase the question, but I'm curious if you would talk a little bit more about like when you work with a scenic designer, like what you find effective or maybe what you don't find effective in my quest to communicate well with a props department.
I love that question. But I'm going to step in and just say like visuals are great. We were in rehearsal for a production of Emma when the pandemic hit. And that scene designer, I was so looking forward to it because he made a prop list, which does not happen that often, and had visuals for each thing, you know, and would say like this is great, and maybe even have a link to it, or, you know, I kind of like the color of this. So anything that can get me into your head so that when you're not there, I feel like I kind of know what your feeling towards something is. I'm certainly going to check back with you. And sometimes I don't think this would be an issue for you, Libby. There's some designers where I'm not getting a lot of communication back with, and what I'll do is maybe send, like, I need to know what kind of table we want. Here are 3 options I've found. You know, I just try to narrow it to make the question as easy to answer. But yeah, I think anything that communicates what you're thinking, and visually seems to be the most easy. But words are good too.
Has there ever been a time when like a designer has overstepped in terms of like when you're dressing the set, or like how do you, like when you're going into tech and you're both on stage at the same time and you have like a set, obviously depends on the production, like how heavy the dressing is or how much you've researched, like how does that relationship kind of go, like when you're on stage with them kind of in the throes of it?
Actually, the pictures back from Royal Family were a great example. That designer was amazing and I love her. But she you know, did scene design obviously, but also did a lot of exhibition artwork on her own. So she's used to being a sole person creating an art piece. And I work in a union house, so I've got a staff. I can't dress the set, but I can tell someone where to put something. So while our designers can do some hands-on stuff, they need to have a union member with them all the time. It's best if they could just verbalize what to do versus doing it themselves, but sometimes we understand it's easier just to do it. So that, there's a little bit of negotiation with that. I don't know, Sadie, if that has been an issue for you when you've primarily been doing props anywhere.
I usually think of how I feel like there's definitely like people when they're freelancing, they have a couple different skill sets, but I think I'm a little unique in that I do set design and prop design. So sometimes I think like I know what the process is, right? Like kind of what I described earlier in terms of like props is hitting the calendar at a different point than set design is. So sometimes I think of it as, what do I need to do to communicate to this person? Because to me, it's sometimes more about communication styles sometimes and understanding how another person communicates, which can be the blessing and the curse of collaborative theater inherently. And I think that that's something that kind of in my years of HR, actually, I think I developed that skill of like really like listening and like it's a fine line because sometimes there's some people that you just have your language and you just get it, and like when you have that experience you're like, oh my gosh, you are like in my brain and this is so much easier. And then there's times where you are doing the like, I hope you like one of these 3 options because your lack of email is not helping me figure out which one you want. So sometimes it is like you spend more time thinking about how to communicate correctly so that it lands rather than just doing the actual communication, right? Because like that's sometimes half of the battle is like asking a question in a way that is going to help that person connect the dots, or kind of like you give a really good example there of like the three tables. Which one do you want? You don't want any of these? That's great information too, because I can keep looking, kind of a thing.
Yeah. And I would say that when I'm working with a designer for the first time, taking on to what Sadie said, one of my first questions is like, how much do you want me to communicate with you? Like, there's a lot, I've been doing this for a long time. So there's a lot of things that come out of rehearsal notes that I can handle, and I'm happy to. And some designers, want to choose what spoon is going next to that teacup. And some designers could care less. Which is fine. I can work either way or anywhere along the spectrum. I just want to know. So I'm only bugging you when either I really need to, or I think you really want me to.
Kind of to piggyback on that a little bit too, sometimes when it's someone you don't know, sometimes you kind of like develop like a list of questions of like, what are going to be the things that I know how I work? So what are the questions that I'm going to ask just in the beginning? Because like sometimes like just literally like in a freelance situation saying, do you prefer to communicate email, text, or Facebook? When someone says, I like Facebook, I'm like, shit, I like email. This probably is going to be annoying to me because I don't like communicating things via Facebook. But if that's what we need to make this work, then I know that that is going to be the level of work that I should expect to go into it. There's also been like some situations where someone is like, oh, text and email, and then you're like having half of the conversation in text and half of it in email, and I'm like, I just should have been more diligent in the beginning. I should have put my foot down. It happens. But yeah, having that list of questions based off of knowing how you work and what's important to you can then be informative to how that person works, so you know how to kind of temper your own energy level and expectation or ramp it up if needed. So, any other questions? Great questions. No questions? I'm going to stop recording then.